Welcome everyone to this month's Wildlife for Lunch. Today's topic is maintaining pollinators while controlling invasive plants. Our presenter is Dr. Megan Clayton with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Wildlife for Lunch is hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. And the funding is made possible by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition, Inc., and again, hosted by TWA and Texas A&M AgriLife. So today's topic, I'm going to go ahead and open up Megan Clayton's presentation here, is again maintaining pollinators while controlling invasive plants. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Megan, giving her making her the presenter so she can go ahead and get us started with our presentation. So Megan, I believe you have controls now. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Cassie. I appreciate it, and thanks to all of you for attending today. I do want to cover, from my perspective, how I view pollinators and their importance on our rangelands and how we might be able to still control invasive plants while keeping them in mind. I am an extension range specialist. I'm based out of the Corpus Christi Research and Extension Center down south. I cover 30-something counties directly, but we have extension specialists stationed all over the state to aid our county extension agents. So again, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate you setting me up here, Cassie. So I wanted to start out by encouraging you, if you have not watched already, Ricky Linex actually has presented on native plants and pollinators for the Wildlife for Lunch series back in March. And he did a fantastic job of talking about pollinators, how they are the plant managers. You know, a lot of times we think that we're actually the plant managers, but there's some other little things out there doing most of the work. He goes into great detail about the monarchs and the milkweeds, the whole story, summarized there for you in his webinar. And he also goes through many specific plants that would be considered pollinator plants and a little bit about seeding these plants. So I'm not going to cover this in great detail today, and so I did want to direct you back to Ricky's talk because he did a fantastic job. There's no way I could ever improve on what he did there. I do want to cover briefly that, you know, a lot of times when we talk about pollinators, we immediately think about bees, and we think about honeybees in particular because we hear a lot about their decline. I may be a little bit callous because I really am in favor of our native bees, that we have over 4,000 species in the U.S. Honeybees are actually from Europe, so they were brought in. I believe it is a concern that they're decreasing because it may indicate that some of our native species are decreasing. But from just a general standpoint, honeybees, since they're introduced, could always be reintroduced if necessary. But what we should really be thinking about is our native bees. Like they're really dependent on our rangelands that we have here, and how can we best keep managing in order to keep them in mind. But remember, it's not just bees. So we have moths and butterflies, beetles, flies, wasps, walking sticks. Lots of things can pollinate our plants and are really considered very important out on our prairies. So I definitely want us to think about bees, but also keep in our mind that, you know, there's a lot of other species who have great importance and are keeping our flowers as diverse and as great as they are. So what's the issue? Basically, as you've probably heard in the news quite a bit lately, we have a pollinator decline, both in our wild and our managed species. They really attribute this to a number of things. One thing that they cite quite often is the expansion of intensive agriculture. In reality, for Texas, specifically, over the last decade or so, we've lost about 1 million acres of working land. So that would be both cropland and our rangelands for our ranches. So I really don't think that expansion of intensive agriculture has changed or has added to this decline, but definitely urbanization, the development of our properties, those properties that are sold off and then later developed in smaller parcels, invasive plant species who may be decreasing the amount of diversity of plants that we have on our landscape, the use of pesticides in some of these areas, and then of course the disease and parasites that are directly affecting our pollinators are all kind of coming together to contribute to that loss of habitat for these important species. specifically in rangeland, since that's sort of where I work and where a lot of our wildlife are managed, these are essential for rangeland food production. So pollinated plants, that's what's providing all the seeds and fruit that pretty much every wildlife species is consuming. They help to maintain our plant diversity, which we know is very important for maintaining wildlife diversity on our lands. They can help with nutrient cycling. Don't forget that they're actually prey for many of our bird species. Some big pollinator advocates may want to not think about that part of it, but they are essential in our food webs. In fact, during graduate school, I did work with Rio Grande wild turkeys, and over winter, they were even consuming a small amount of insects consistently. And so not only when the young are born and their young birds are born and they're highly reliant on that insect component of their diet, but even hens during the winter are also looking for those insects because we stay so warm here. Wildflowers and wildlife have recreational value. There's no doubt that the value of our land is being driven by this, and they also provide other ecosystem services. So when we have these plants that are providing good sources of pollen and such for our pollinators, they're also holding our soils, and I don't think there's anything better as an ecosystem service that a plant could provide than protecting our important topsoils that we have here on our landscapes. Because that's not only going to dictate what can be grown right now, but that's sort of dictating what can ever be grown in the future. And even a study out of California showed that the chaparral, or what's basically just a shrubland, had the largest diversity of bees per unit area of any other ecosystem type. So don't just think about our wildflowers as providing these services. A lot of our brush and our tree species that also flower provide a lot of the resources that these pollinators are looking for. So when I talk about rangeland plant composition, I always like to throw in this slide because it shows how we do have our brush, our woody, or our browse species, depending on kind of how we're talking about them. Those are all flowering species. We have our grasses, which have long linear leaves, and they may not be as attractive to pollinators, but they still house a lot of the pollinators. They may nest in these grass areas. They still provide some importance. And then, of course, we have our forbs, F-O-R-B, forbs, or our weeds, and these are all of our broadleaf plants. So as opposed to the long linear leaves of grasses, the forbs are more of our wildflowers, the ones that most people think about when they think about keeping pollinator species going. So those are going to be our three main categories that I'm going to reference quite a bit during this talk. So that brings me to, what is an invasive plant? So I put that in my title, and then later I thought, man, that's kind of controversial because a lot of people have a different definition for what an invasive plant might be. When I think about an invasive plant, I'm really thinking about something that's taken over an area. I call it does not play well with others because it doesn't tend to keep the plant community as a community. It kind of tends to take over a community. But there are invasive plant lists that are directly related to plants that have been introduced and are an invasion problem. So don't confuse those. I'm talking about both native and exotic plants both. Also, sometimes people refer to these as noxious plants because they think that includes both native and exotic plants. But for my purposes today, I'm going to refer to invasive as anything that's not playing well with others on our landscape. And I was curious, for those of you attending live, if you have an invasive plant in mind that you either deal with regularly or you have on your property, would you just type that into the chat box down there? Let's see some of the issues that you seem to be having, things that you would want to manage while at the same time we're going to keep these pollinators in mind. Okay, I see one response already. Anybody else out there? I'm betting they didn't set up the chat box. Also, do check to make sure that you are sending that to all participants if you do send something in. China berry, yeah, we hear that one quite a bit.
And hi there, Megan. This is Cassie. There's some saying Bermuda grass, careless weeds, large and small Leaf, then let's see, arundo, buffelgrass, chinaberry,
Great.
ligustrum.
All right. So ligustrum is kind of like privet, like Chinese privet. Arundo is the giant reed. So some of you have probably heard of these before. KR blue stem, that's a huge one. Multi-star thistle, Johnson grass, frostweed, broomweed, absolutely. So those are all great examples of plants that we have trouble with on our rangelands. And so if we decide to completely leave everything in pristine condition for pollinators, I think we're going to see a real decline in the usefulness of our rangelands. And so definitely we want to keep these invasive species in mind while we're going through our management options and think about what might be best to help manage those. And maybe I'll have a few minutes at the end that I can address some of them specifically if you have questions. Okay, so when we talk about rangeland management tools, it looks like my slide came up without, yeah, so it's not using the animation, so I apologize for that. But there's actually 4 main range tools that we think about when we're trying to manage rangeland, and that's fire, prescribed fire, chemical applications, mechanical applications, and then biological control. Biological is a little bit fuzzy, I think, and really what we're talking about there is using either insects to control certain plants or the grazing by livestock species such as goats and cattle. So I'm going to talk about specifically cattle grazing today, so that will be the 4th one. But then the sign that so helpfully came up at the beginning, do nothing, I like to throw that in as maybe a 5th rangeland management tool because we have all these great resources for things that we can do to the land, and it's very exciting to think about how we can apply some of these techniques. But in some cases, it may be best to leave it alone. So I think somebody mentioned KR bluestem, King Ranch bluestem. That species, if you're not going to intensively, and I mean very intensively, try to control it, you would be better off to leave it alone because so many of these practices that I just listed could potentially spread that plant. So that's the same issue with a lot of these invasive species that you've listed. So I did throw in do nothing as a consideration because sometimes the management may not be worth the control and we may be harming our pollinator populations and not succeeding in our goals for our plant management. So my process today is just going to go through these 4 different management tools, and we're going to look at how they can be beneficial and why they may not be the best thing to use for certain situations. So the first one I'm going to pick on is prescribed fire. I always like to use this slide when I talk about prescribed fire. I know everyone on this webinar probably already knows this, but for anyone who comes in and just watches this on the fly, I want you to know that prescribed fire is very different than a wildfire. So wildfire is something that just occurs through an act of nature or by accident, as opposed to a prescribed fire, which is actually planned to accomplish very specific objectives. So you have certain conditions that you're looking for, both in the weather and in the fuel load, and you go through certain procedures to ensure that it's as safe as possible. I don't think we can actually control fire, but we can manage all these variables to make it a very successful burn. So for that reason, I think it's a very important management tool for us to look at today. So there's a ton of positives for burning. One is to restore and maintain suitable habitat long term. So if we took prescribed fire out of the equation, a lot of our lands here in Texas developed with regular burns. So that's kind of changing the dynamic of our landscape if we were to eliminate prescribed fire from it. It will long term actually make a more sustainable and more diverse landscape for pollinators. Brush management. It's a little bit difficult to actually control a lot of our brush species that are resprouters, and we'll talk about that later. But like in that picture over on the right-hand side, you can defoliate an entire brush species, and even if it's a resprouter, it'll come back from the base as a smaller stature, and that might allow more plant diversity around that plant. So there could be some benefits even from a brush management standpoint. It creates a patchwork, which is always great for providing different types of plant communities, which will allow for maybe some different flowering times throughout the year that would provide for these pollinators. It could change that vegetation composition. So depending on the timing of the burn, you may take out certain weed species, or you may actually open it up and allow more bare ground for weeds to germinate when things green up in the spring. So the timing of the burn can actually help support your goal. Parasite or insect control, originally that may not sound real positive from a pollinator standpoint. You might think I went a little crazy putting that in there, but you know, there's a lot of insects who eat quite a bit of foliage and kind of keep plants from flowering out. So there are some competitors in there. There's also a lot of our pollinators that fly. So if you consider that they could fly out of the area that's being burned, then they would be safe, and it would actually help control some that might be more parasites, such as our fever tick down here in the south. And then, of course, fuel management. So we get these high fuel loads. That usually means a lot of grass. And so we just looked at the fact that usually those things that we think about being strong pollinator plants tend to be our forbs and our brush species. So once we get a high fuel load, that makes for conditions that could cause a really rapid wildfire to spread, and that would not be beneficial long-term for pollinators. And you could even use prescribed fire for innovative grazing. So if anybody's seen a nicely fresh burned field that comes back really green, very palatable green grass, highly nutritious, livestock will congregate on those sites. So that's actually a way that you could move your livestock, maybe even keep them from consuming forbs in another area for a period of time, and they would concentrate on that area that was recently burned. So we'll look at that when we talk a little bit about grazing as well. So, of course, I said all these nice positives about prescribed fire, so I kind of have to throw in potential negatives. So, an inexpensive tool, this prescribed fire is, and so it is a constraint that it's possible that people would plan to burn too large of an area, and so that doesn't leave enough adjacent habitat nearby for recolonization of these pollinator species. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. It has been shown that you could extirpate some species that have very limited range. So depending on the size of your burn, again, if it got too big, you could harm some species such as the prairie specialist butterflies. They may be vacant from that area for 3 to 5 years, although they will recover. Bee populations would be significantly lower in years following a burn, but again, they will come back in, especially when those nice lush forbs come up and they flower again. I think you'll see a lot of recolonization, but this could be a short-term effect of a prescribed burn. Also, it's not always a reliable invasive plant control. So if you're looking at some sort of perennial weed species, or you're looking at brush species that's a resprouter, prescribed fire is not necessarily going to provide you that control. It's more of a general health of the rangeland type of technique. So again, you can put the burn out there certain times a year to hit some goals, but in general, it's not going to always be the most direct way to control invasive plants like the ones that y'all have listed earlier. I see a question here about how about mowing in early spring. We're going to talk about mowing here in a little bit, and then if you still have a question about that, definitely type it back in there. But we're going to cover mowing under mechanical control. So for prescribed fire management, consider a rotational pattern, maybe patch burning no more than 30% of the area in a year. That allows other areas to go ahead and to flower and seed out and provide those pollinator species with something to munch on in the meantime. They are reliant on grass as fuel, so in drought type of years, it'll be very difficult to get a really good burn over all of the area anyway. So typically you're kind of restrained as to where you can burn anyhow. Be aware if there's adjacent areas, they need these for recolonization sites. So especially during drought, you might have a harder time allowing those pollinators to move to a nearby area because of the dry conditions. Things just might not be flowering as well. So keep those things in mind during dry years. time your burns when the target pollinators are not in a critical stage. So a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, that means looking at maybe a winter burn. So it's not when our plants are necessarily flowering out and really beneficial. And then once those spring green ups come, you're going to have a lot of plants come on that will provide a nice food resource for them later on. And then finally, I put in there, messy burns could be a good thing. So a lot of times people say, that was a really great burn, burned really solid through the pasture. But, don't discount the value of a messy burn. So I mean by that, maybe it doesn't get completely through an area, but that area will be left to provide some habitat for these pollinators until the rest of that land comes back. So messy burns could be good. Okay, next, getting on to the question we just had, mechanical management. So we covered prescribed fire. Next, we're going to talk about mechanical. Mechanical control has a lot of pros. A lot of our brush species, when they become invasive, you can remove them from the roots. And grubbing or either root plowing. Root plowing is pretty invasive as far as disturbing our soils. So a lot of times people go to grubbing individual plants. That's a little bit less minimal soil disturbance. Temporarily, mechanical control could suppress most of our plants, including our invasive woodies. We're going to talk a little bit more detail in a second about shredding, so I'm not going to dwell on that one very long, but they can remove the top part of plants. Disking, especially like in late winter, can encourage more plant diversity. So you could actually encourage annual forbs to come up by mowing late winter, early spring, just like the suggestion there was. That's very effective for allowing a lot of those seeds to come up. And our seeds in the soil, so there's a lot of free seed in that topsoil of our native plants, and say like a woolly distaff thistle, that seed can remain viable for germination for like 19 years. So a lot of these forb seeds are viable for a really long time. So they'll sit dormant in your topsoil waiting for the right conditions to come up. So don't discount what you have until you really do a little bit of disking and work to see what free seed you have there, because plantings can be quite expensive. And then a mechanical control pro for sure is that you can use it in combination with herbicides where needed. So a lot of times if you're really targeting a certain plant, it helps to mow that and allow it to come back very green, and then spray your herbicide on it so that that green material gets in a lot of herbicide to kill that plant. So you can use mechanical control with some of our other tools that we're covering today. So now with the cons, mechanical control is really looked down on in some situations because of its disturbance of the soil. Like 1 inch of topsoil, you're looking at anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years to recover that 1 inch of soil. So anything you can do to not disturb it would be better for your land long term. Also, mechanical control can be quite expensive. So sometimes people tell me, well, it's not because I already own the equipment. That's true. If you don't have to lease or rent somebody to come in and do the work, then it is relatively more economical. But you have a lot of maintenance on these machinery, and I think you should take that into consideration too, because the time that you spend on that tractor and also the maintenance that you provide, in addition to the fuel, is all going into the cost of that treatment. Plants also can adapt to frequent mowing. So we see this a lot with the example on King Ranch Bluestem. When they're mowed frequently, they tend to start to seed out at a lower height. So it's possible that you think that you're controlling some of these plants by keeping up with the mowing, but if you don't do it quite frequent enough, that plant can actually outsmart you and sort of adapt to that situation. So that can be a little bit frustrating. And then my last bullet there, I always maybe lose a couple of people on this one, but I really equate shredding when you get on a tractor and you basically just mow an area. Unless you're opening up areas like along a roadside or keeping a place safe, it's really sort of like therapy. So I think instead of maybe paying for a counselor, people prefer to sit on a tractor because it's really a good feeling. And after you shred, for any of you that have before, you know how great that looks. like it really looks amazing, at least for a short period of time. But a lot of times when we shred, we're not actually accomplishing the goal that we had in mind. And so in a way, you could waste money unnecessarily. So shredding can actually cause the mortality of eggs or larval stages for these pollinator species. It creates a uniform height, which lowers structural diversity, which is what not only our pollinators are looking for, but a lot of our wildlife species who depend on these lands. Has lower nesting site availability, so that kind of goes back to the point before that. You need a lot of these tall grasses left in order to provide bunch grasses for ground nesters or to hide fawns in during certain times of the year. Also, shredding can remove the flowers uniformly if done at flowering time, and so it kind of eliminates that resource for that entire area, even though it does look quite nice. If the goal is to manage an invasive weed, spraying is usually more effective and economical. So there's a study done that looked at a comparison of spraying or shredding. When you shred an annual weed, since that has to come back from seed each year, you might prevent it from going to seed. But if you've had it there in the past, more than likely you already have those seeds in the soil. And remember, we just talked about that those seeds can remain viable for germination for a long time. If it's a perennial weed that you're trying to mow to control, it has a really established root system, and it'll just come right back from the root. So maybe even in that same growing season, it may come back. So really consider what the goal is for that and whether spraying that small area where you're having the invasion of a certain weed species might be more effective long term to where you don't have to continually mow each year and take away those flowering resources from the pollinators every year. Okay, so if you're going to do mechanical management, there are some really great things that you could take into consideration. One would be to conduct your treatments during the winter when no flowers are blooming. That's a pretty easy one to think about. Plus, it's cooler in the winter time than in the summer, so it might actually be a little bit more pleasant for you on the tractor. Also, choose some treatments with less herbage impact, such as grubbing as opposed to root plowing or shredding only in certain areas where absolutely necessary, because you are going to take out everything equally that grows in that area. You might consider doing mechanical treatments in smaller patches. So nothing says that you have to do the same thing to an entire pasture. So if you took a small area and started to apply your management, you could see if you get the results that you're really looking for before committing to doing other areas. And at the same time, you're allowing these other areas to provide valuable flowering plants for these pollinators. And then, of course, like we talked about, you could do some late winter disking and encourage some forward growth. It's kind of like making your own free food plot. So that's a technique that's used quite often, and it's very effective. Okay, so we're going to move into our next section on grazing. This was our biological control, but because cattle grazing seems to be one of the most popular forms of biological control here in Texas, that's sort of what I'm going to focus on today. So, of course, there's a lot of positives to grazing. One is that cattle can utilize this large amount of grass species, and we just said that pollinators, they might utilize grass, but maybe not in the abundance that we would hope. A lot of our wildlife species too do not utilize large amounts of grass in their diet. So cattle could actually be brought in and used as a management tool for wildlife. So also they're the only tool that directly pays you back. So if you manage correctly, you could eventually sell the offspring of these cows, and that would be income for you rather than just paying out like you would with any of our other management tools. You could also use grazing in combination with some of our other tools. We'll look at the example of maybe patch burning and then grazing intensely on those patch burns to come up with some different plant communities and kind of reset everything back to the same equal playing ground. Also, grazing can provide structural diversity. When cows go out on a rangeland, they're seeking their ice cream plants. So those are that are the most palatable and those that are the most nutritious first. So they're not stupid. They're definitely going to go after certain plants first. So they start to create this structural diversity on our landscape that's hard to mimic with really any other tool. So as long as you have your stalking rate set correctly, that can be a really definite positive for grazing. Also, when cattle go in and take out some of this grass, it opens up bare ground that allows a lot of these weeds to then germinate. So in order for these weed seeds or these forb seeds to germinate, you need sunlight to hit the soil surface. So once it does, it's going to sprout up these new weeds, and they're going to encourage more pollinators to come into the area because they're providing these nectar-rich plants. And then the negatives, of course. So one would be that it's not a solution for many invasive species issues. So if we're talking about toxic, unpalatable, or larger brush, probably cattle are not going to help you even suppress those invasive species. So a lot of those that you listed there would not necessarily be something that a cow is going to go after. So they may not be actually contributing in that way. Also, it's important to keep in mind that cows eat forbs and browse. So we talk a lot about them being grass eaters or grazers, but they could actually be a browser in a number of ways too. So here's our typical livestock diet. You see cattle over there on the left, estimated at about 80% grass. Sheep also eat quite a bit of grass, and then goats as well, even though it's quite a bit less than cow would eat. So then they also have that forb and browse component with all three of these livestock species. So never lose sight that their diet is still quite diverse, despite maybe preferring a grass diet. So when we look at the benefit of grazing cattle, a lot of times that's to increase forb production. But if you get too many cows, they can really be competitive for forbs. So I want to look at this example from some data that Dr. Ortega got off of Wilder Wildlife Refuge. He showed that the diets there for forbs was about 39% for cattle and about 72% for deer. So when people think about maintaining good pollinator plants, a lot of times immediately deer are their enemies because deer are going to eat so many forbs. That's true. Deer do prefer to eat forbs, but let's look at the numbers behind this. So an 1,150-pound cow, if it takes in about 26 pounds of dry forage per day, that's 30 pounds that it's eating. And if you take into consideration 39% of that, like on Wilder Wildlife Refuge, is forbs, that's 11.7 pounds of forbs that one cow is eating per day. Let's take a 100-pound deer. If they take in about 3.5 pounds of forage a day and they eat 72% forbs, that's 2.5 pounds of forbs. So I think you can see where I'm going with this, that a single cow can actually consume quite a bit more forbs than a deer. And so it's important not to eliminate cattle from our landscape, but to understand that we need to figure out the ideal stalking rate for cattle so that you're promoting all of your goals for your property. So of course, in addition to them eating browse and forbs, they could reduce the nectar and pollen sources just because they're eating them. They could harm nesting sites because they're all over there, but usually that's when you have them in more concentrated situations. This next bullet I left in there just because it sort of makes me chuckle that they can cause, they've been noted for causing the direct trample of adult bees. I don't know that any cow seeks out trampling an adult bee, but I guess this could be a factor, so I left it in there. Another negative could be that it reduces bee species richness, and I think this is more a secondary effect when we have too many cattle. Perhaps this study had too many cattle on it, and they were removing too many of our nectar producing and pollen sources for our pollinators. All right, so grazing management. What are some things we might want to think about if we want to manage 4 pollinators at the same time? Obviously, be aware of flowering patterns. So if you could potentially leave your best pollinating habitat free during that time when they're flowering, that would be ideal. Conduct a rotational grazing system with a low to moderate stalking rate. This is really advisable for anyone who also has a goal of maintaining nice wildlife species on their property. You want to exclude cattle for long enough periods of time to allow that vegetation community to recover. So if you keep cattle pressure on it constantly, you can have a negative effect on your plant composition and your plant's ability to survive. We're going to look at this in a little bit more detail here in just a second. And then if you're lacking forbs, you could actually use cattle to your benefit by patch grazing some areas more intensely during the winter and opening up that bare ground to encourage the forb growth during the following spring. So in a sense, you're kind of doing the same thing like the disking late winter that we talked about. You're opening up bare ground to where those seeds can then come up. So let's look at some different prescribed grazing practices. One is continuous grazing, and I apologize, my animations are not working, so it's going to be a little bit weird. But on continuous grazing, they're either grazing all of your pastures, like you don't have fences, or maybe like in this situation, you do have fences, but the gates are open. So essentially, they could go into any of these areas at any time. Continuous grazing is very difficult to manage. There's no way for you to keep your cattle away from those ice cream plants for any period of time when they're continuously grazing, because they have access to those constantly, and those are the ones that they're going to continuously seek out. So in addition, you're not going to have the ability to maintain some areas with nice diverse pollinator plants because those cows can also access those. So continuous grazing is a really tough practice to maintain long term. What's much more preferred is something like a deferred rotation system, and this is where you would graze maybe more than half of your pastures at the same time, but you're allowing some of those pastures like those two up in the northern area of the ranch to rest or to be deferred for some period of time, and those plants will grow back. So basically you're concentrating your cattle, but knowing that after you rotate them, that place that the cows leave is going to have a longer period of time to recover. Deferred rotation is also nice because you have the ability to bring in extra livestock on years that you might have an abundance of forage, and on years that you don't, you could just simply not bring them in. So in this example right here, I have some cow-calf pairs. Those cows I would probably try to keep all year long, but then you could also bring in like these stalker steers like you see over on the left-hand side when you have an abundance of grass one year and you'd like to open that back up more for forbs. That would be an opportunity where you could bring in extra cattle and make utilization of that grass, those grass plants, and then when you sell those steers, you're going to make some profit back. So the idea would be to use a management tool that's going to also bring you in money. Short duration grazing is where you might graze less than half of your pastures at one time, but they're moved in a way to where that pasture is going to have an even longer time to recover. So there's a lot of benefits to this type of system, although it's a little bit more intense to manage. Sometimes people even do smaller, short duration, high frequency type of grazing systems. I even know some who move their cattle every few hours, so essentially they're like shepherds with these cows. But in a much less intense system, you could congregate your cattle in an area, really graze that down heavy, and then move those cattle off of it for a long period of time, and you could guess what type of plants are going to come back first. So probably your annual forbs and your perennial forbs and your different grasses. So slowly the system's going to be built back up, but in the meantime, they're going to be providing a lot of those pollinator plants that you may be looking for. Another thing is innovative grazing with water. So let's say you just don't have the type of fencing system set up that you'd like. And although there are some really great programs available through USDA, NRCS, EQIP, for helping you to install some fencing that would make your grazing system a lot more manageable, you could in the meantime adapt something like this water technique that they do in the larger pastures out west. So they might turn off 3 of those waters and just leave 1 of them on, and they would naturally congregate around that one watering hole. Another thing that we talked about briefly earlier was innovative grazing with fire. So you could burn a little patch like done here, and even if you had all of your gates open, I guarantee you all of these cows, you can't see my motion, but all those cows do go onto the green patch, and they eat that area very intensely because that's new green lush growth. So that's one way to get the cows to congregate in an area without actually having to develop more fencing. So when we allocate forage, we used to say take half, leave half. That was kind of the old rule. But we realized that trampling and insects actually account for about 25% of the forage use. So we're actually only taking 25% for our livestock. And then if you were going to run a low to moderate stocking rate, you would actually even take less than that. So our goal is to always leave 50% of that plant standing when we move the cows out of that pasture. That does a number of things for us, leaving the stubble. It maintains soil health. It allows those dormant plants to be added back into the soil as organic matter. It helps rain to infiltrate better, and most importantly, it keeps our forage plants healthy. So as we graze these plants, they're naturally adapted to grow back. But over time, that cow's going to keep eating that same desirable grass plant over and over again. And after it keeps putting its resources to growing leaves, where is it not putting its resources? Right, into growing roots. So eventually you end up with plants like over on the left-hand side, and the disadvantage is they can't reach that subsoil moisture. So when we don't get rain for some period of time, those are the first plants to die off. And they were your best grazing plants. So that's really a tragedy for your pasture. So maintaining relatively low grazing pressure is not only beneficial from a pollinator standpoint, but it highly benefits people from their plant communities and the health of their land long term. So the important thing here that I'm trying to drive home is to monitor your stocking rates closely. So no matter what you do with cattle, it's important to make sure that you have the right stocking rate. And there's publications and there's a lot of professional help that can help you do that. So our final section I want to cover today is herbicide applications. And I put this big controversial stamp across it because that's how I feel most of the times when I talk about herbicides, but particularly when we talk about pollinators and herbicides. All right, so why do we even use them? If there's so many negative things about herbicide, why do we continue to put them out on our rangelands? One is because there are a lot of resprouting brush or tree species. And what I mean by this is that if you picture the soil surface at the top of that picture down to where the first lateral roots come out of that plant along this stem is called the bud zone. So it might go down to 18 inches deep, just depending on how old that tree is. And so all those little wart-like looking features on the stem are actually buds. So anytime that plant is, the top is removed from burning or a mechanical practice, like it was shredded or bulldozed over, or maybe even somebody applied the wrong herbicide, so it's just top killed, that plant is triggered to grow out from some of those buds and it becomes a multi-stem plant, even if the original plant is just a single stem tree. So think like your honey mesquite. That's this type of plant. Pretty much anything I can think of in my area is a resprouter. When we get into the hill country, blueberry juniper or ash juniper is not a resprouter. So that's one that if you cut it off, it will not grow back. So that's a very big difference between it and most of the other trees and brush that we deal with in Texas. So why do I say we need chemicals for them? Well, it's really one of the most effective things that we have to actually control the plant without making our problem worse. Another thing that chemicals can do is lower or eliminate soil disturbance. So a lot of the other techniques, like the mechanical techniques that we talked about for plant management, has high soil disturbance, and that's something that we would love to get away from if at all possible. Also, it is true that if you control weeds or broadleaf plants on a pasture, you can gain a pound of native grass for every pound of weeds that you control. And if you have introduced grasses on that pasture, like in a highly intensive like cattle ranch, those could yield you 2 to 3 pounds of grass for every pound of weeds control. So there is data back there that shows, you know, if you do weed control, you can benefit by providing more forage for livestock if that's your main goal for the property. So here's just an example. This area was sprayed in that small spot, and you can see the benefit that it would have on those grasses being able to then get a lot of the soil moisture, the nutrients, and the sunlight as soon as things improve. So whereas on the left-hand side, a lot of those resources went to the weeds. So finally, it's a fairly economical thing for us to use, or a tool for us to use on our rangelands. When we spray aerial mesquite, I'm just rough estimating $40 to $45 per acre to put it out with a helicopter. That equates to $4,000 per 100 acres. When we spray broadcast weeds with like a ground rig, that might cost anywhere from $25 to $38 per acre, depending on what herbicides we're using. So even on the low end, that's like $2,500 per 100 acres. And you might be thinking, that doesn't sound economical. But long term, actually controlling some of these invasive species can be much more beneficial than a temporary fix, like a lot of our shredding does. And why would I also give you these numbers? A lot of times people tell me that ranchers just put out chemicals like crazy, and that needs to be regulated more highly. And my argument would be that a lot of your ranchers are not, and to invest in their property by trying to control some of these invasive plant species, they're investing a lot of money. So it's really hard for me to believe that they're just kind of willy-nilly throwing this kind of cash at their land. They're really doing some long-term planning to try to improve that property for their goals, whether that be livestock or wildlife, or most likely a combination of those. And then number 5, there's more selective herbicides on the market today than we had even 5 or 10 years ago. And so there's a lot of benefits now to using herbicides to be able to target certain plants and not so much affect the other plants that are more desirable in the area. And so that's another reason that I feel like they're used quite readily today. So herbicide use can reduce the amount of forage and egg-laying resources naturally for these pollinators. It can limit consistent sources of nectar, pollen, and nesting sites for active adults if it's done on a really large broadcast scale. Excuse me, it can reduce moths and butterflies and field margins used by game birds. So we're really talking about a farming situation there. When they use herbicides to control the weeds, that might take out opportunities for these game birds in the area. And also on a farming situation, herbicides can further reduce fruit and other food sources. So this is kind of stuff we already knew. You hear about this a lot in the news, how herbicides can be taking out that food resource. Can herbicides directly harm pollinators? This is a question I hear quite a bit. And I've really looked through a lot of literature trying to find exactly what herbicides would directly harm a pollinator. And by that I mean directly kill that insect. So we know that indirectly they could harm them by reducing their pollinating resources. But even glyphosate was reported in several different reports to not actually hurt bees. They may have affected their learning and nectar homing behavior, which again, I think that goes back to the availability of plants, like how many pollinating plants are available in the area. Herbicides are repeatedly cited as reducing the number of flowering plants and lowering their food availability. So that's sort of where herbicides are a negative for pollinators, not so much on directly killing them. Herbicides actually have very different modes of action than any insecticide would have. So most likely they're a growth regulator. That's the most common type that we utilize on rangelands, and this upsets the plant's hormonal balance, which causes it to eventually die. There's also photosynthesis inhibitors that keep that plant from doing photosynthesis to create more carbohydrates or sugars for itself to keep itself alive. And then pigment inhibitors, which is kind of similar, it destroys the green pigment in the leaf, so it's not able to do photosynthesis like it normally would. And I put ... because there's a lot of other different modes of action in these herbicides, but for the most part, the way they work is really affecting plant systems, and so maybe not directly on an insect like an insecticide would. A lot of times people say that pesticides are bad, and pesticides lumps in herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, like all kinds of stuff go into that category. So it's important to talk about them in their respective sections. So what could you do as far as herbicide management to be able to use this really great tool for controlling invasive plants and not harm pollinators as much as possible? One is to conduct individual plant treatment techniques whenever possible, and that's just spraying individual plant instead of spraying broadcasted. This is cheaper anyhow. Any rancher that has the opportunity to do what we call IPT, individual plant treatment, is going to do that over broadcast treatment simply because they're going to save quite a bit of money. A lot of times if they have to do a broadcast treatment, they'll follow up with these individual plant treatments, and we'll go through a few of these options. If aerial application is necessary, maybe consider staggering their treatments by different sections each year. Sometimes when aerial treatments are done, you'll see a forb decrease afterwards, depending on what herbicides were used. But we've shown time and time again that usually within one growing season, these forbs are back. So it is a temporary reduction. So if you can stagger where you're treating, then that would allow these forbs to still be in other areas. And then, of course, avoid non-selective herbicides as much as possible. So non-selective herbicide would be kind of like glyphosate or Roundup that's going to kill pretty much anything that's green. There's a lot of herbicides for rangelands that are available now that are more suited for certain species. And then practice drift reduction applications, because you do want to always make sure that you're applying that herbicide directly to your target species. And then combine these herbicide applications with mechanical alternatives where it's appropriate, such as mowing beforehand to increase the ability of that herbicide to get directly onto those target plants and into that green leaf material better. Brush Busters, we also have a Weed Buster series, but Brush Busters was one created for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service way back, I believe early 90s, to figure out how we could individually treat these plants that have become invasive without harming other plants around it. So they use the most safe and effective chemicals as possible, the lowest rate as needed, and it goes through step-by-step telling you how to do these. And these are available on our AgriLife bookstore website, which is just agrilifebookstore.org. So some of the treatment possibilities that are covered in Brush Busters is leaf spraying individual plants. We'll cover all of the leaves until they're wet but not dripping. That plant is supposed to be mature, leafed, actively growing, and it's going to take that herbicide down to the root system, that bud zone that we saw in that earlier picture, to kill that plant. Another option is stem spraying individual plants, where you're going to direct a herbicide and usually a diesel mix directly onto that stem about 12 inches high all the way around. No need to let it puddle up, and that can control some of these invasive plant species, invasive brush species, I should say. And the last Brush Busters technique is the cut stump method. That's where you'll cut off the invasive brush species as low and as flat to the ground as possible, and then spray the remaining stem and cut stump surface with a diesel and chemical mixture, so that plant won't resprout. So again, if you had blueberry juniper or ash juniper, these you would cut and they would not sprout back because they're not resprouters. But most of our other species, we do have to apply a small chemical mix to them in order for them to not come right back. So in conclusion, realize that we all need pollinators. So it's really what we're dependent on. If you like to eat, you should have an appreciation for pollinators, and I, for one, really love to eat. Also, we need to manage or apply our treatments in a multi-year cycle. So think about doing some treatments on a patchwork size, something small enough to where you're not impacting your entire area that pollinators would be benefiting from. And I think this is really great from a financial standpoint and a good range management standpoint anyway, because you're able to see if your applied treatment is actually giving you the results that you were hoping for. So really a great idea, no matter whether you're managing directly for pollinators or not. Use spot treatments whenever possible, and if you do have to do a broadcast treatment of some sort, always think about putting some money aside for following years to do spot treatments to kind of get the most bang for your buck and draw out that lifetime that's going to be good for your property. Finally, I don't think it's a huge shift in our current practices in order to include pollinators in our management plans. We just need to be aware of our timing, intensity, and scale. So I really don't think any of these tools in our range management toolbox need to be removed. I think they just need to be applied more carefully and more aware of all of the competing goals that we have in our plan for our ranch. A couple sources of information that if you're interested in reading a little bit more on it, really science-based information was found both in the Rangelands Journal. They had a pollinator species in 2011, and you can find this at rangelands.org. And then the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has a lot of great information about invertebrate conservation. Just be sure to check where their sources came from. And then that's my email address. I'll stay on to answer questions as long as we need to, but I realize it's about 1 o'clock, and if you're here on your lunch hour, feel free to email me if you have a burning question or if you have a plant that you're having trouble with that you need some options. That's my email address. And again, I'm down in Corpus Christi, but I'm happy to help no matter where you are. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions, Cassie, if you had any come in or if I missed any.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Megan. And yeah, everyone, if you do have questions, I know maybe our chat window was acting a bit funny earlier, but if you could go ahead and put them in there. I believe I'm able to see it also when it says to the panelists as well. So we'll give everyone just a couple seconds here to maybe type in any questions you may have. I think we covered the mowing question from earlier already. So again, please send that in via the chat window, not that Q&A section. The Q&A section hopefully should not be available, but if so, we're not able to see that. So again, if you could chat it via the chat section. And somebody here, Jackie Harker, is asking if it's possible that they can get a copy of your presentation or a copy of your slides, Megan.
Sure, absolutely. Just shoot me an email and I'll send you it. I may, depending on your email, I may have to do it as a PDF, but I'd be happy to share that with you.
Great, thanks. We'll let a little time pass by, just a couple reminders for everyone. Again, thank you all for joining us in our Wildlife for Lunch this month. When we do sign off, there should be a pop-up window with our survey, and we encourage you to please give us a bit of feedback. And also, for anyone that participates in our survey, we'll enter you into a drawing. We're actually going to do a drawing for a dove hunt for 2 down in South Texas. So if you'd, again, like to complete our survey. Also, here in a moment, I will put up the link where you will be able to find this archived version of this presentation along with all of our other Wildlife for Lunch from previous months. So again, please feel free to visit there. They're also found in our YouTube channel as well, that you can find anything from, again, pollination to water to deer. We've pretty much covered all the different topics. And then lastly, just for everyone's awareness, we did have a webinar scheduled for December. Originally, it was December 31st. 21st. We've actually bumped it up to December 14th. So our December one is December 14th with Mike Petter presenting the benefits to wildlife and stream and wetland mitigation banks. So I hope to see you all again at that point too. And Megan, let's double check to see if anyone else has put in any more questions. And I do not see them at this time. It looks like we're getting a lot of thank yous for your presentation. And so again, everyone, thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Megan, so much for participating in our Wildlife for Lunch, again, with a partnership of Texas Wildlife Association and Texas AgriLife Extension Service. So I think with that, again, thank you to all, and we hope to see you again in our next presentation.